There are some issues and questions around the existence of dyslexia, and this overspills into the other SpLDs. In this video, I want to look at some of the connections and processes that happen with neurons and see how these could underpin Dyslexia-SpLD and answer some of the questions. So what I propose to do is look at a baby's brain and what happens while it's learning, look at how neurons connect together and what might cause random connections. Then I'm going to build a hypothesis as to how these interactions between neurons can underpin Dyslexia-SpLD. I will list the questions and then discuss them in the light of this hypothesis. So looking at a baby's brain. When the baby is born, there are innumerable neurons and connections. The baby hasn't learnt how to relate to the world around it. But as it does learn, then some of the connections are used over and over, and others are not used. And the ones that are not used die out, so that just an effective set of neuron connections are built. And this is neuronal pruning, so that as a child goes through the early years of childhood, a lot of pruning happens as learning is effectively learnt. Now I want to look at neuron structure. We have a cell body with a nucleus, and from the walls of that cell we have dendrites, projections coming off, and these will connect up with neighbouring neurons. Then we have an axon which will take the signal from the neuron when it fires, and that will take the signal to other neurons, dendrites of other neurons that this particular neuron is connected to. That may be neighbouring neurons, it may be a long way down the body. And the places where the connections are made are called synapses. And then as a cell is used, as a neuron is used over and over again, a myelin sheath is built down the axon to take the signal much faster and allow connections between neurons to go very quickly. So that if we go back to the child's brain, then the myelination makes those neurons that are building these together and making the learning happen very much more stable and matured, as I've represented by thickening the lines. And then for later convenience, I've coloured them green. Now I want to look at how neurons connect together. And in doing that, I want to talk about neuron assemblies, two neurons firing together, and how they would wire together. So can you talk about a complex network by just drawing diagrams of a single neuron? And you can. It is something that is done within the discipline that works with neurons. And I was very happy to see that in the Royal Institute Christmas lecture of 2023, Mike Waldridge used a very similar process in the first lecture of simplifying a mass of neurons working together and represented them by a single one. And I'm told in a private email by Professor Duncan Astle from Cambridge that groups of neurons are referred to as neuron assemblies or populations, and that's what I'm going to use in this video. So looking at two neuron assemblies, we have neuron assembly A and B. And if A is taken over its firing potential and sends a signal down the axon, then this is connecting up to the neuron B. And if that takes neuron B over its threshold, it will fire and pass the signal on down through the network. So these two neurons wire together. When they connect like this, the assembly A sends a signal down to B and B then fires. And gradually, the synapses, the places where A is connecting onto B, those are called synapses, the structure of the synapses change so that the signal passes much more effectively from A to B. So now let's consider what happens when you've got another assembly sitting and affecting B. So here I've got assembly A connecting up to B and assembly C connecting up to B. And you can see by the size of the blobs representing the synapses that C has a greater impact on B than A does. So then when A wants to fire, you may have the situation that it's sending its signal down. It's fired several times with B, but on some occasions, C is having a greater impact on B than A is, and C is keeping the potential, the firing potential of B below its threshold. So then B will not fire when A fires, and the impact of A firing down will go somewhere else. So C is preventing the effective firing and wiring of A and B together and sending the signal probably off somewhere else, so that random connections will be made when A and B can't fire together. And if you just think about the way in which dyslexic people learn, then if they don't learn how to spell properly, one particular spelling will have many variations in their brains, and they will randomly use any of these variations when they want to spell a particular word or have been asked to spell a particular word. So that's the sort of thing where C is not connecting up properly, and when A wants to produce some sort of spelling, it's going off somewhere else. So this is what I'm saying is the situation for Dyslexia-SpLD. You've got the baby with exactly the same networking that happens, and some amount of pruning happens, but not the same amount as happens with people who don't have Dyslexia-SpLD. So then what happens? Those different connections are used over and over again. The different spellings are used over and over again. And myelination is not done because a particular connection is what society wants. Myelination is done because cells are connecting up together over and over again. So this network of connections that are being used by the dyslexic SpLD brain get myelinated, get matured, get set down there. Now, we know that later on, a child will be able to learn the correct spelling, but it doesn't erase the connections that have matured through the time in which the child has been using all those different spellings. So this is the hypothesis, that we have a child at risk. There are these connections C that exist within the child's brain that are diverting the signals. So the pruning and the wiring and firing do not behave as expected, and Dyslexia-SpLD develops. So then the Dyslexia-SpLD is observed through the variety of behaviours that are well documented, and correct later learning does not erase the matured dyslexic SpLD. So children being at risk is well known. The behaviours that are observed are well known. That the correct learning does not erase the developed matured SpLD, this is known, this is experienced, but it's not much discussed. But what's new is that the pruning and the firing and wiring together do not behave as expected, so that the Dyslexia-SpLD develops. So what might be happening for neuron C? From support work, both with children and with adults and with university students, then multisensory learning and many other strategies are not used as effectively as they should be. That's for dyslexia. For dyspraxia, then learning and organization are disrupted from the way the body frame keeps moving. With ADHD, attention shifts too much, and that can disrupt learning. I don't have any suggestions about dyscalculia and Neurons because I'm not a maths teacher, so I haven't supported any students who have maths problems with dyscalculia. I have traits myself, but I know that anybody supporting a student with dyscalculia needs to understand and come from maths teaching as it is done these days. How to engage the neuron C will be the subject of further videos in the network of material that I'm developing, but it's too much for this particular video. So the questions that arise: does dyslexia exist? Is there a cure? What is dyslexia? Can one usefully talk about mild, moderate, severe dyslexia? Does intelligence matter for the definition of Dyslexia-SpLD? What is the difference between dyslexic people and non-dyslexic poor readers? Are the interventions the same or different for dyslexic people and non-dyslexic poor readers? Why is there so much co-occurrence among the various SpLDs? Why are there so many variations of problems and solutions, and how useful are labels? Does Dyslexia-SpLD have an impact beyond just reading and spelling? Would the benefits of dyslexia disappear if we could avoid dyslexia developing? Why should resources be diverted to support dyslexic SpLD people? So dyslexia was the first specific learning difficulty to be observed, and the others slowly emerged away from dyslexia as groups of symptoms and problems didn't quite fit the way the language element of dyslexia. They are all grouped together because the symptoms and the problems are very similar, and the way in which one supports people with the different SpLDs are very similar. Most of the questions arise in the context of dyslexia, but the answers spread out over all the different specific learning difficulties. Does dyslexia exist? Is there a cure? What is dyslexia? So you'll gather from what I've been saying that from my experience in my own brain working with other people, dyslexia is this network of misconnections that exist in our brains and that can be activated at any time in our lives, whether we want to activate it or not. And it's there, it exists. Is there a cure? No, there isn't a cure. Later learning does not eradicate that network that has built up while you were a child. Can one usefully talk about mild, moderate, severe dyslexia? Personally, I don't think you can, and many of the people that I've worked with also don't think you can, because you can understand your dyslexia, you can know how to manage it, but every now and then something will happen that trips you into your dyslexic SpLD way of thinking, of being. You don't know when these triggers into dyslexia are going to activate that network. But once you've got into it, you may be stuck there for half a day, for a day. There is talk of good and bad days when people know, okay, this is a day I'm going to be hampered by dyslexia for the whole of the day. And there are other days when you're, okay, this is going to be a good day. But you can't talk about mild, moderate, or severe. It's not like short or long-sighted, and where you can have a set of glasses, a prescription that deals with your long or short-sightedness, and that's okay, that's the problem solved, maybe only solved for a few years, but it's basically solved. Dyslexia-SpLD is not like that. So talking about mild, moderate, and severe doesn't actually fit the lived experience. Does intelligence matter for the definition of dyslexia-SpLD? And are there differences between dyslexic readers and non-dyslexic poor readers? The interventions are the same and different. There's issues around there as well. In 2024, a new definition of dyslexia was produced and published under SASC. And in that, then it is recognized that some or all of the language abilities are not commensurate with other ways of showing intelligence. So intelligence has come back. It has an intermittent role. Sometimes it's ruled out and sometimes it's very definitely part of the definition. Now, I think it's quite important that it is in the definition, because if you've got somebody who's very intelligent but who's struggling, they will find a way round a problem that may not be the way that goes through the language system, but which diverts, avoids the problem and produces the task in a different sort of way. For instance, a child who's given a page of 20 words to write out, then doesn't want to write out the single words 3 times over. So produces a page where they've written all the first letters of every single word, all the second letters, all the third letters, down the line. That's not going to teach spelling of the words that they've been given, but produce that piece of paper to the teacher. It looks great. All 20 words have been produced 3 times over, and then the teacher is very surprised when those words are not spelt correctly in a later task. So there are differences between the way in which dyslexic people approach the language tasks, how they avoid them, and the way in which non-dyslexic poor readers approach them. Because the poor readers, they are the ones who, the non-dyslexic poor readers, are the ones who've got less intelligence. They're just as valid in society, but they are slowly working through the interventions. They have not got any assembly C diverting their brains into other different ways of doing something. So their connections A to B will slowly develop, and they will not be pushed into random connections. So the interventions may well be the same for dyslexic readers and non-dyslexic poor readers, but the way in which they're taken up by the brain, the way in which they are interacted with by the individual people may be quite different, and that difference needs to be taken into account and observed and used. So why is there so much co-occurrence among the various SpLDs? Why is there so much variation within one label of the problems and solutions? So, and how useful are the labels? Well, the way in which the connections are made in the brain, once you've got something like the assembly C that is causing the neural signals to go off in other directions, where they go to will very much depend on the individual people. So there is going to be overlap. There are going to be variations of the problems and the solutions. What the different labels show is the root cause of some problem that is going wrong, but it doesn't show what the response is going to be faced with a problem that is not making the right connections. So the labels are useful. They alert people to the fact that somebody needs to pay attention to how this particular person is learning, and then gradually, hopefully, that child and person take ownership for their own learning and their own approach to things so that they have agency. So the labels are useful, but they are not the whole story. And it's working with the individual that is the most important thing, having got the labels. But from this point of view, of this hypothesis, then both the co-occurrence and the variations within one label are not surprising. So dyslexia-SpLD are about the way your brain and mind think about something. We only have one brain, one mind. So every time we are doing something, we are using this. And the way in which we approach something, it's not just about reading and spelling. It's about everything in life. Learning a new computer system is still, you may not be learning new programs, but you've got a new operating system. And that is going to have a potential trigger into dyslexia-SpLD. If they're going to change the supermarket setup, then that is a new situation. Learning a new language. Any time that you are faced with a new situation, then you are potentially going to be at risk of being triggered into a dyslexia-SpLD functioning. And it is not just about reading and spelling. They are the places where different ways of thinking are first signaled by a child's learning. A lot of very competent dyslexic people in the adult world have said that once they've got beyond the problems of dyslexia, they really appreciate the other ways that they think, their unorthodox ways of thinking. And if dyslexia for them, if dyslexia is the price they pay for those other ways of thinking, then for them it's a price worth paying. Now, I think that those other ways of thinking are some of the things that are influencing the Assembly's C, and that we ought to be looking for those and using those right from the beginning of a child's life. So they won't disappear. They will be enhanced and honoured all the way up through a child's life. Should resources be diverted to support dyslexic SpLD people? So many of the things, ways of thinking, ways of teaching, ways of learning, actually, the ones that are vital for dyslexic SpLD people, they are very good practice for everyone. So if we just looked in the whole at what works really well for dyslexic SpLD people and brought those into mainstream education, we would actually benefit a lot of other children and learners. So the resources would not be diverted away from other people. They would be brought in and everybody's learning experience improved. So some final thoughts. Well, a hypothesis proposes a new model or theory. I've done that in saying that connections, neuronal pruning and wiring and firing together underpins what happens in dyslexia-SpLD. So it had some starting questions, and the hypothesis has answered those starting questions. And it's indicating further development, looking at how we can search for the Assembly's C and use them to make a lot of problems really disappear. So that's future development. But immediately from this video, from this hypothesis, then observing and responding has to start early, before the connections go off into random directions, and before that sort of confusion gets matured. We need to give agency to the unorthodox thinkers so that they are using their other ways of thinking, and they are the ones who are in control and organizing how they do something. And I've said that what's vital for dyslexic SpLD is good practice for all. So catering for dyslexics in primary school, it has been done. One of my colleagues did this very, very successfully. And it works. And such catering is emotionally, socially, and financially cost effective. So let's go for it. it can be done, and it's to the benefit of all. The page that goes with this video that is on the website Dyslexia-SpLDs.com has a text version of this presentation. It's connected up with ideas in living confidently with specific learning difficulties, which is a whole series, 4 books in a series. There are also links to related videos in this series and references to other people's work. So that is the end of what I want to say about the way in which neuronal processes, I'm hypothesizing that they underpin dyslexia SpLD, and we can move forward very effectively from here.